The family disowned her in the cold, sterile light of the solicitor's office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and fresh grief. They did not shout, for they were people who equated decorum with power, but their judgment was a tangible thing, a pressure in the room that made Alara's lungs feel tight. Her grandmother Elena's will had been read, a simple document that distributed a lifetime of modest savings and sentimental trinkets with a quiet, methodical fairness that infuriated them. Her uncle Robert, a man whose tailored suits never quite hid the soft paunch of his discontent, received a collection of first-edition novels he would never read. Her Aunt Carol, a woman who measured love in carats, was bequeathed a set of porcelain dolls whose vacant eyes seemed to mirror her own. To her cousins went small sums for their education, sensible amounts that offered a foundation but not an escape. And to Alara, the quiet one, the one who had spent weekends learning to bake her grandmother's bread and listening to her stories while the others were busy climbing social ladders, was left the object of their collective scorn, a rusty, dented music box that hadn't played a note in 30 years. The solicitor, a man with a face like worn leather, read the final line with a distinct lack of ceremony. To my dearest Alara, I leave my little box of memories. May it sing for you when you need it most. A choked, incredulous laugh escaped from Robert's throat. A box of memories, he'd repeated, the words dripping with derision. That's it? After everything? She leaves the girl a piece of junk. Alara said nothing, her fingers tracing the corroded filigree on the box's lid. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked, and cold to the touch. It felt like an anchor. This moment, right here, was the true inheritance. It was the final indelible lesson from her grandmother, a lesson in value. If you're just joining us on this journey, make sure you subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now back to that cold, silent room. The family's silence was a verdict. Alara could feel their eyes on her, stripping away her grief and leaving only a strange, pitiable curiosity. They saw a fool, a sentimental girl clinging to a worthless scrap of metal while they had been handed assets, however meager. They saw weakness. Quote 3. Carol had said, her voice a silken blade. Quote 4. But Alara's grip on the box tightened. Quote 5, she said, and the word, though spoken softly, seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. It was the first time she had ever truly defied them. That was when the disownment became explicit. It wasn't a single declaration, but a series of small, sharp cuts. Robert's dismissive wave of the hand, Carol's sigh of theatrical disappointment, the way her cousin suddenly found the pattern of the carpet intensely fascinating, refusing to meet her gaze. The unspoken consensus was clear. By choosing the symbol of their grandmother's perceived eccentricity over their collective pragmatism, she had chosen to be an outsider. Fine, Robert said, standing up, the sound of his chair scraping against the polished floorboards a sound of finality. Keep your scrap heap, but don't come to us when you realize sentiment doesn't pay the rent. He didn't need to say more. The lines were drawn. She was no longer one of them. She was the girl with the rusty box, a relic herself, clinging to a past they were eager to liquidate and forget. She walked out of that office and into the gray afternoon, the city air damp and chilling. The weight of the box in her arms was a strange comfort, a solid, tangible piece of the woman she had lost. The door to the solicitor's building closed behind her with a heavy, definitive click, severing a bond she hadn't even realized was so fragile. As she stood on the pavement, the muffled sounds of traffic surrounding her, she looked down at the box. Its surface was a map of rust and time, the once gleaming silver now a mottled brown. It was ugly. It was useless. It was everything they said it was. And yet she felt a fierce, unyielding loyalty to it. It was a promise she had made to her grandmother, a silent vow to remember, to value what others discarded. She held it closer, the cold metal seeping through her coat, and began the long walk home, a journey into a future where she was utterly, terrifyingly alone, with nothing but a broken music box to light the way. The apartment was small, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbor's television, and the perpetual drip of a faulty pipe somewhere in the building's ancient plumbing. It was a space defined by what it lacked: warmth, light, comfort. It was here, in the dim glow of a single lamp, that Alara placed the music box on her worn wooden table. It sat there, inert and silent, an accusation in the center of her solitary life. The sting of her family's rejection had settled into a dull, persistent ache in her chest. Their words echoed in the quiet room. A piece of junk, sentiment doesn't pay the rent, an eyesore. For a fleeting, desperate moment, she saw what they saw: a worthless object taking up space in a life that had no room for excess. Her rent was due next week, and her job at the local library, a place of quiet refuge, barely covered her expenses. The small inheritance her cousins received, the very sums they had scoffed at, would have been a lifeline for her. Instead, she had this heavy, useless box. Grief and frustration churned within her. She ran her hands over its surface, feeling the rough texture of the rust under her fingertips. She tried the lid, but it was sealed shut, fused by years of neglect. She shook it, but there was no rattle, only a dense, solid thud, as if it were filled with packed earth. The little winding key on the side was frozen in place, a silent testament to its brokenness. "Sing for me when I need it most," she whispered, her voice cracking, repeating her grandmother's words from the will. "I need it now." The box remained silent. A wave of anger, sharp and unfamiliar, rose within her. It was anger at her family for their cruelty, at her grandmother for leaving her with a riddle she couldn't solve, and at herself for being so weak, so sentimental. In a fit of despair, she gripped the box and slammed it down on the table. The sound was a dull, unsatisfying crack of wood, but the box was unharmed. She did it again, harder this time. A small piece of the table's cheap veneer chipped away, but the box remained stubbornly intact. Crying now, tears of rage and sorrow blurring her vision, she grabbed the heaviest book she owned, a thick, hard-bound dictionary, and brought it down on the corner of the box with all her strength. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the small apartment, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible click. Alara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was tiny, but it was a response. It was the first sound the box had made. She wiped her eyes and leaned closer, her heart pounding. The impact had done something. Along the ornate seam where the lid met the base, a hairline fracture of light appeared. It wasn't broken. It had been opened. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a trembling curiosity. Using her fingernails, she carefully pried at the seam. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a soft sigh of released pressure. The lid lifted, not on a hinge, but straight up, like the top of a puzzle box. The interior was not what she had expected. There was no velvet lining, no tiny spinning ballerina, no intricate clockwork mechanism of pins and cylinders. The space was hollowed out and lined with dark, polished wood, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. And nestled in the center, resting on a bed of what looked like dried, blackened moss, were two objects. The first was a key. It was unlike any key she had ever seen. It was small, wrought of a dark, heavy metal that didn't reflect the light, and its head was fashioned into an intricate, stylized bird, a raven perhaps, with its wings half furled. The second object was a tiny scroll of parchment, no bigger than her thumb, yellowed with age and tied with a single strand of crimson thread. Her hands trembled as she untied the thread. The parchment was brittle, and she unrolled it with painstaking care. On it, written in her grandmother's elegant looping script, was a single sentence. It wasn't a clue in the way she might have imagined. It was a fragment, a line of poetry that felt both familiar and utterly alien. It read, "Where the silent bells toll twice." Alara stared at the words, her mind racing. It was a riddle, a key and a riddle. Her grandmother hadn't left her a broken toy. She had left her a beginning. The weight in her chest began to shift, the ache of loss and loneliness transmuting into something else, something sharp and focused. It was a spark of purpose. She looked around her small, bare apartment, at the peeling paint and the flickering lamp, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a starting point. The box was not an ending. It was a doorway. Her family had been wrong. Her grandmother had been wrong. The box didn't sing with music, it sang with mystery. And as the city outside murmured its endless, indifferent song, Ilara sat in the quiet of her room, the strange key cold in her palm, and began to listen. The phrase became an obsession, a mantra that echoed in her mind as she stocked shelves at the library, as she lay in bed at night staring at the ceiling, as she walked the gray city streets, where the silent bells tolled twice. It was a beautiful, lyrical line, but it was also maddeningly vague. It clung to her thoughts like a ghost, a whisper from a life she was only now beginning to realize she knew nothing about. Her days fell into a new rhythm, a dual existence. By day she was the quiet librarian, her movements soft and methodical, her voice a hushed murmur among the towering shelves of forgotten stories. But by night, her small apartment transformed into a command center for a singular, all-consuming investigation. She filled notebooks with theories, scoured the internet for hours, and cross-referenced old city maps with historical archives. She searched for poems with similar lines, for local legends, for anything that might give the words context. The search was a descent into a rabbit hole of forgotten history. She learned about bell foundries that had closed a century ago, about churches that had been demolished to make way for skyscrapers, about town criers and their historical routes. Every lead was a thread that she followed with painstaking patience, and every thread led to a dead end. The city she had lived in her entire life began to feel like a foreign country, a landscape of secrets hidden in plain sight. Her family had not called. The silence from them was a constant low hum of disapproval in the background of her life. In a strange way, their absence was a gift. It freed her. There was no one to mock her quest, no one to tell her she was wasting her time on a dead woman's fantasy. There was only the riddle, the key, and the growing, insistent feeling that she was on the right path, even if she couldn't see it. The breakthrough came not from a computer screen, but from the dusty, tactile world she inhabited every day. She was reshelving books in the library's local history section, a neglected corner filled with crumbling volumes on municipal planning and parish records. Her fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound book titled A Cartographic History of the Diocese. More out of habit than hope, she pulled it from the shelf. The book was heavy, its pages brittle and smelling of time. As she leafed through the detailed maps of the city from the late 19th century, one image caught her eye. It was a map of the industrial district down by the old abandoned wharf, an area now characterized by derelict warehouses and urban decay. On the map, nestled among the factories and shipyards, was a small, unassuming cross symbol labeled, quote, 11, quote. Beneath the name, in smaller italicized script, was a parenthetical note, the twin spires. Ilara's breath caught. She traced the symbol with her finger. Twin spires. 2 towers, 2 bells. She quickly cross-referenced the chapel in a city gazetteer from the same period. The entry was brief. Quote 12, quote, the silent bells toll twice. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a place. A cold thrill, a mixture of excitement and fear washed over her. The next day, she left work early, a flimsy excuse offered to her supervisor, and took a bus to the edge of the city. The wharf district was a skeleton of its former self. The air was heavy with the smell of salt, rust, and decay. She walked through a labyrinth of crumbling brick warehouses, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the gray, choppy water of the bay. And then she saw it, set back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown ivy and surrounded by a rusted wrought iron fence, stood a small Gothic-style church. It had 2 spires, just as the map had shown, 2 stone fingers pointing accusingly at the overcast sky. They were identical, twin towers for twin bells. The place was utterly derelict. The stained glass windows were shattered, the heavy oak doors were boarded up, and a sign on the gate, almost completely obscured by rust, read, "Danger, keep out." This was it. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. This was the place her grandmother had sent her. A sense of her grandmother's presence washed over her, so strong it was almost a physical touch on her shoulder. She wasn't just following a clue. She was walking in Elena's footsteps. She was retracing a journey her grandmother had intended for her. The fear she felt was overshadowed by a profound sense of connection to the woman she missed so dearly. But the chapel was sealed, a fortress of decay. The fence was high, topped with cruel-looking spikes. The boards on the door were thick and held in place by heavy bolts. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows that danced like specters among the gravestones in the small, unkempt churchyard, Alara stood before the gate, her hand gripping the strange, raven-headed key in her pocket. The problem was no longer where to go, but how to get inside. The silent bells were waiting, and she knew with a certainty that defied all logic that they held the next answer. Getting inside the chapel became a new obsession, a logistical puzzle that consumed her waking thoughts. The direct approach was impossible. The boarded doors and barred windows were a clear statement of intent from the city authorities. For 3 consecutive evenings, she returned to the derelict church, circling its perimeter like a patient predator, studying its weaknesses. She noted the crumbling mortar in the north wall, the section of the iron fence that was bent and weakened by a fallen tree branch, the single high window on the eastern facade whose boards seemed looser than the others. Each detail was a potential entry point, a chink in the armor of neglect. The place was deeply unsettling, especially as twilight bled into night. The wind whistling through the broken spires sounded like a mournful sigh, and the skeletal branches of the overgrown trees clawed at the stone walls. It felt like a place that held its breath, waiting. On the 4th night, she came prepared. Dressed in dark clothing, with a small crowbar and a flashlight in her backpack, she felt like a common thief, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The irony was not lost on her. Her family had accused her of clinging to worthless sentiment, and here she was, breaking into a condemned building in pursuit of it. She slipped through the bent section of the fence, the rusted metal snagging her jacket with a sharp, tearing sound. The churchyard was a chaotic cemetery of fallen headstones and tangled weeds. She moved carefully, the ground soft and uneven beneath her feet, until she reached the base of the chapel's stone wall. The air was cold, carrying the damp chill of the nearby bay. Looking up at the dark, imposing structure, a wave of doubt washed over her. What was she doing? Chasing a ghost based on a cryptic note. But then she felt the hard, unfamiliar shape of the raven key in her pocket, a tangible link to her grandmother's purpose, and her resolve hardened. She chose the north wall, where the mortar was weakest. Using the tip of the crowbar, she began to pry at the stones. It was slow, arduous work. The mortar crumbled into dust, and the stones were heavy and awkward. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate feel of paper, were soon raw and scraped. After what felt like an hour, she had managed to loosen a single, large stone at the base of the wall, creating a dark, narrow opening just large enough to squeeze through. The air that wafted out from the hole was thick and musty, a centuries-old exhalation of dust, decay, and trapped silence. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her backpack through first, then wriggled her way into the darkness, the rough stone scraping her back. She emerged into absolute blackness. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. It was a deep, resonant void, heavy and oppressive. It pressed in on her ears, amplifying the sound of her own ragged breathing. She fumbled for her flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut a sharp, lonely cone through the darkness, illuminating a world frozen in time. She was in a small sacristy behind the main altar. Dust lay thick as a blanket on everything, on a rotting wooden vestry, on a pile of hymnals whose pages had fused into a solid block, on the skeletal remains of a rat in the corner. She stepped out into the main nave, her flashlight beam dancing across rows of dust-shrouded pews. Moonlight struggled through the shattered stained glass windows, casting fractured, colored patterns on the floor that looked like pools of blood and seawater. The scale of the place was breathtaking. The vaulted ceiling soared into the darkness above, lost in shadow. A massive, overturned baptismal font lay on its side like a fallen giant. The air was thick with the ghosts of forgotten prayers. Her grandmother's clue had led her here, but it gave her no indication of what to look for. She began a systematic search, her light sweeping over every surface. She looked for loose floorboards, for hidden compartments in the altar, for any mark or symbol that might resonate with the design of the music box or the key. On the front of the stone altar, half obscured by grime and cobwebs, she found it. It was a small carved symbol, no bigger than her palm, a stylized raven, its wings half furled, identical to the head of the key in her pocket. Her heart leaped. This was the spot. She ran her hands over the cold stone around the carving, pressing and probing, searching for a hidden mechanism. Nothing. She examined the floor in front of the altar, tapping the stone flags, listening for a hollow sound. There was only solid, unyielding stone. Frustration began to creep back in. The symbol was a confirmation, but not an answer. She sat down on the steps of the altar, her flashlight beam pointed at the raven carving, and tried to think like her grandmother. Elena was never simple, never direct. Her lessons were always wrapped in layers of meaning, where the silent bells tolled twice. The location was the clue, but perhaps the clue was also in the action. She looked up towards the shadowy ceiling, towards the twin spires she could not see. The key she held wasn't for a door. What if it was for a lockbox? And what if that lockbox was somewhere no one would ever think to look? She cast her light around the base of the altar again, this time looking not at it, but under it. She lay on her stomach on the cold, dusty floor, the smell of decay filling her nostrils, and angled the beam into the dark, narrow space beneath the heavy stone slab. There, tucked deep in the recess and invisible from any other angle, was a small, dark metal plate set into the stone foundation, and in the center of the plate was a keyhole. It was a perfect match for the raven key. With trembling hands, she reached under the altar, the space cramped and awkward. She slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it. There was a low, grinding sound of metal on metal, a sound that hadn't been heard in a century. A section of the floor tiles directly in front of the altar shifted, and a heavy stone slab slowly began to rise, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath. Inside the cavity sat a small, iron-bound chest, its surface coated in a thick layer of grime. It wasn't a treasure chest filled with gold, but something far more precious to her. It was the next step. As she lifted the heavy chest from its hiding place, she had the distinct, chilling sensation of not being alone. A floorboard creaked in the darkness behind her. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting wildly through the nave. The light caught a fleeting movement in the shadows by the far wall, a flicker of motion that was gone as soon as it appeared. The silence that followed was heavier, more menacing than before. She was no longer just a girl on a quest. She was a player in a game she didn't understand, and for the first time, she realized someone else might be playing too. The chest was heavy, its iron bands cold and unforgiving. Back in the relative safety of her apartment, with the door bolted and a chair wedged under the knob, Elara placed it on her table beside the now empty music box. The two objects looked like they belonged together, a matched set of silent storytellers from a forgotten era. A profound sense of unease lingered from the chapel, the creak of the floorboard, the fleeting shadow. It could have been her imagination, a trick of the light and her frayed nerves. But the feeling of being watched had been too potent, too real. It was a cold knot of dread in her stomach that refused to dissolve. She tried to push the fear aside, focusing instead on the chest. It had no visible lock, only a complex-looking latch mechanism on the front. After several minutes of careful examination, she discovered that a series of small, raised symbols on the latch had to be pressed in a specific sequence. The symbols were astrological, and after cross-referencing them with her grandmother's birthday, she found the combination. With a final, satisfying click, the latch sprang open. The air that escaped from the chest was dry and smelled of leather and ink. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, were two items that made her breath catch. The first was another key. This one was larger and more ornate than the raven key, crafted from a brighter, silver-like metal. Its head was fashioned into a detailed compass rose, the cardinal points elegantly rendered. The second item was a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with time, and its pages held together by a simple leather tie. A wave of reverence washed over her. This was her grandmother's. Her handwriting, her thoughts, her secrets were contained within these pages. She untied the leather strap with trembling fingers and opened the journal to the first page. The script was dense and elegant, but it was written in a language she didn't recognize. Interspersed with complex symbols, and what looked like astronomical charts. It was a cipher. Her initial elation gave way to a familiar sense of frustration. It was another wall, another layer of mystery her grandmother had erected. This wasn't just a treasure hunt anymore. It was an apprenticeship. Elena was testing her, forcing her to learn, to think, to become someone capable of understanding what she had left behind. The sense of being watched returned, stronger this time. She found herself glancing at her window, at the thin curtains that separated her small, illuminated room from the vast, dark city outside. Paranoia began to take root. Was the family's public display of disappointment at the will reading a trigger? Had their loud complaints about the worthless music box inadvertently alerted someone else that a long-dormant puzzle had been set in motion? The thought sent a chill down her spine. They had, in their greed and blindness, potentially painted a target on her back. She was an amateur delving into a world of secrets, and she was beginning to realize that she was dangerously out of her depth. She needed help. Her mind immediately went to one person, Professor Alistair Finch. He was a retired university professor, a man who had been a dear friend to her grandmother. He specialized in historical cryptography and ancient languages, a niche field that had made him something of an eccentric legend at the university. Ilara remembered him from her childhood as a kind, gentle man with eyes that twinkled with curiosity, who smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. He and her grandmother would spend hours in deep conversation over tea, their discussions filled with words and names that meant nothing to Ilara at the time. Finding him was not difficult. He was still listed in the university's emeritus faculty directory. She called the number with a shaking hand, and a warm, slightly frail voice answered on the third ring. "Professor Finch," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She explained who she was, the granddaughter of his old friend, Elena. A warm chuckle came down the line. "Ilara, my dear child, of course I remember you. You had a formidable talent for spilling tea on my tweed jackets. How is your wonderful grandmother?" The question was a punch to the gut. "She passed away, Professor," Ilara said, the words still tasting like ash. "A few weeks ago." The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with sorrow. "Oh, my dear, I am so terribly sorry. She was a remarkable woman, a light in a dim world." Ilara took a breath and explained everything. The will, the music box, the keys, the chapel, the coded journal. She tried to keep her voice steady, to sound rational, but the paranoia crept in as she described the feeling of being followed. When she finished, there was another long pause. "Ilara," he said, and his voice had lost all its earlier warmth. It was now low, cautious, and grave. "You must come and see me immediately. Do not speak of this to anyone else. Bring the journal and the keys and be careful. Terribly, terribly careful." The urgency in his tone terrified her. "Professor, what is it? What did she leave me?" "She didn't leave you a thing, child," he replied, his voice a somber whisper that chilled her to the bone. "She left you a burden. Your grandmother was not a simple baker of bread. She was a guardian, and it would seem she has chosen you as her successor. What you have uncovered is not a game. It is a legacy, and there are others who have been waiting a very long time for it to surface." The line went dead, leaving Ilara in the echoing silence of her apartment. The journal on the table no longer looked like a collection of memories. It looked like a weapon. The keys no longer seemed like clues to a fortune. They felt like the weight of a crown she never asked for. Her small, simple life had been a comforting illusion, and it had just been shattered. Outside, a car she didn't recognize slowed as it passed her building, its headlights sweeping across her window before it moved on, disappearing into the night. Professor Finch lived in a house that seemed to be an extension of himself, a cluttered, book-filled sanctuary that smelled of leather, dust, and brewing tea. Books were not just on shelves, they were in precarious stacks on the floor, on every available surface of his desk, on the chairs. It was a fortress of knowledge, and as he closed the heavy oak door behind Ilara, she felt a sense of security for the first time in days. The professor himself was smaller and frailer than she remembered, but his eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, were as sharp and intelligent as ever. He moved with a quiet, deliberate energy, his hands gesturing as he spoke, weaving a story that systematically dismantled Alara's entire understanding of the woman who had raised her. He led her to his study, a room dominated by a massive mahogany desk littered with maps, magnifying glasses, and half-finished translations. He took the journal from her hands with a reverence that surprised her, his long, delicate fingers tracing the worn leather cover, as if greeting an old friend. Quote, 24, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Quote 25. He opened the journal and for a long moment, he simply stared at the coded script, his expression a mixture of nostalgia and deep, somber respect. Then he began to work. With a practiced ease, he pulled reference books from his shelves, cross-referencing symbols, comparing script styles, muttering to himself in what sounded like half a dozen different languages. For Alara, it was like watching a master locksmith pick an unpickable lock. Slowly, painstakingly, the journal began to give up its secrets. Quote 26. He explained, pointing to a line of text. Irene, quote 27. He tapped a recurring symbol. Nargina, quote 28. Over the next several hours, with the professor translating aloud, a new portrait of her grandmother emerged, one painted in the stark, dangerous colors of history. Elena had been the latest in a long line of guardians, a secret society of one, tasked with protecting a vast fortune. The lineage, the journal explained, began in the early 20th century with a group of European intellectuals, artists, and philanthropists who saw the continent marching towards self-destruction. They pooled their immense resources, wealth from industry, from old aristocratic families, from art sold in secret, and hid them, creating a shadow endowment. It was not a hoard to be spent, but a tool to be used. The Guardian's purpose was to wield this fortune as a silent, invisible force for good, to anonymously fund hospitals in war-torn regions, to establish scholarships for brilliant minds in impoverished communities, to protect endangered ecosystems, to be a counterweight to the greed and power that fractured the world. The $284 million figure, mentioned only once in a detailed ledger at the back of the journal, was not a prize. It was a responsibility of terrifying magnitude, Alara whispered, her voice filled with awe and a dawning, crushing sense of understanding. All the oddities of her grandmother's life suddenly snapped into focus. Her fluency in obscure languages, her strange, knowledgeable visitors, her sudden, unexplained trips. The way she seemed to carry a quiet sadness even in her happiest moments. She had been living a double life, bearing a weight Alara could barely comprehend. But the journal contained more than just a history, it contained a warning. It spoke of a rival faction, a group that had splintered off from the original founders. They called themselves the Covenant. They too believed in the power of the fortune, but their philosophy was starkly different. They saw it not as a tool for humanitarian aid, but as an instrument of control. They believed that power, consolidated in the right hands, their hands, could steer the course of history more effectively than charity ever could. They viewed the Guardian's mission as a naive, sentimental waste of resources. For generations, the Covenant had been hunting for the fortune, waiting for a Guardian to falter, for a successor to be chosen. Quote, the third. The professor said, his voice low and grave as he translated a particularly chilling passage. Quote, 31. The feeling of being watched, the shadow in the church, the car outside her apartment, it wasn't paranoia. It was the Covenant. They knew. The death of a Guardian was the one moment the legacy was vulnerable. The transfer of knowledge, of keys, of responsibility, that was the moment they could strike. Your family's public argument over the will, the professor surmised, his face grim. It was like a flare in the darkness. It announced to anyone watching that the succession had begun. Alara felt a wave of cold fury towards her relatives. Their petty greed had not only cast her out, but it had also placed her in the crosshairs of a powerful, unseen enemy. She looked down at the two keys sitting on the desk. The raven and the compass rose. They were no longer just pieces of a puzzle. They were symbols of a war she had just been conscripted into. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The professor closed the journal and looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. "You finish what your grandmother started," he said. The journal says the final step requires both keys, used together, in a place of absolute neutrality and security. A bank in Geneva. You must go there, Ilara. You must claim your guardianship before they can intercept you. This is no longer about discovering the past. It is about securing the future. The journey to Geneva was a masterclass in quiet paranoia. Professor Finch, revealing a level of strategic thinking that belied his academic exterior, orchestrated their travel with the precision of a seasoned spy. They didn't book direct flights. Instead, he purchased a convoluted series of train tickets that would take them on a meandering path through 3 different countries, with multiple changes at small, unassuming stations. Quote 37. He'd explained, his voice a low murmur as they sat in his study, planning their route on a large old-fashioned map. Quote 38. He also insisted they travel separately for the first leg of the journey, meeting at a prearranged cafe in a quiet Parisian arrondissement. He gave Ilara a new simple coat to wear, instructed her to leave her phone behind, and provided her with a small burner phone containing only his number. Quote 39. He told her, his hands on her shoulders, his gaze intense. Quote 40 hards. Leaving her apartment felt like abandoning a former life. She packed a single small bag with only the barest essentials. The 2 keys she stitched into the lining of her coat, their weight a constant, heavy reminder against her chest. The journal. Too precious to risk, she left in the professor's care. As she walked to the train station in the pre-dawn gloom, every face in the sparse crowd seemed to hold a hidden meaning, every passing car a potential threat. The city she had known her whole life felt alien, a web of unseen observers. She followed the professor's instructions to the letter, her senses on high alert. She was acutely aware of anyone who seemed to linger too long, anyone who met her gaze for more than a fleeting second. The journey was a blur of train carriages, rattling tracks, and foreign landscapes flashing past the window. It was also profoundly lonely. Without her phone, without books, with only her own churning thoughts for company, she felt the full weight of her new reality settle upon her. She was adrift, cut off from everything she had ever known, on a mission she didn't choose, heading towards a confrontation she was utterly unprepared for. In Paris, the cafe was exactly as the professor had described. A small, quiet place on a side street, smelling of coffee and old wood. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking for all the world like a harmless academic on holiday. The relief of seeing his familiar face was so overwhelming she almost cried. "Well done, my dear," he said with a small, encouraging smile. "You have a natural aptitude for this. Your grandmother would be proud." From Paris, they traveled together, their conversations sparse and whispered. The professor continued to school her, not just on the history of the Guardians, but on the philosophy of the Covenant. He described them as disciples of a cold, brutal logic, men and women who believed in social engineering on a grand scale, who saw individual lives as acceptable collateral damage for the greater good they were trying to achieve. They were not common criminals. They were ideologues, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. As their train crossed the Swiss border, the landscape changed. The rolling hills gave way to the sharp, imposing peaks of the Alps. The mountains were majestic and indifferent, their snowy caps gleaming in the cold sunlight. They were a fitting backdrop for what was to come. Geneva was a city of quiet, immense power. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the hum of hidden money and veiled influence. The bank was not a modern glass and steel skyscraper. It was an old, formidable stone building on a quiet, cobbled street overlooking the lake. It had no large signs, only a small, discreet brass plaque bearing a name that was synonymous with centuries of secrecy and wealth. The Banque de Clairvaux. As they stood across the street looking at its imposing, windowless facade, the professor turned to her. "This is as far as I can go," he said, his voice heavy. "The final step must be taken by the successor alone. That is the rule." He handed her a small sealed envelope. "This contains the account information and the necessary credentials, as stipulated in the journal. Everything you need is in there. Once you are inside, you must ask for the archival vault. They will understand." He looked at her, his eyes full of a heavy mixture of pride and fear. "Remember what Elena wrote in her journal, Ilara? Wealth is a tool, not a throne. The choice you make inside that bank will define not only your future, but the very meaning of your grandmother's life. Be strong. Ilara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She felt like a child being sent off to her first day of school, terrified and alone. She watched him turn and walk away, a frail, stooped figure disappearing into the crowd, leaving her to face the legacy on her own. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she smoothed down her coat, feeling the solid weight of the 2 keys against her chest. Then, with a resolve she didn't know she possessed, she crossed the street and pushed open the heavy bronze doors of the bank, stepping out of the light and into the cold, silent heart of power. The interior of the Banque de Clairvaux was less a building and more a monument to silence. The floors were polished marble that seemed to absorb all sound. The walls were paneled in dark, rich wood, and the air was cool and still, like a cathedral or a tomb. There were no tellers, no queues, only a single, imposing desk at the far end of the cavernous lobby, behind which sat a man who looked as though he were carved from the same marble as the floor. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face a mask of polite, professional indifference. As Ilara approached, her soft footsteps the only sound in the immense space, he looked up, his eyes cool and assessing. He did not smile. His voice was quiet, cultured, with a faint French accent. Ilara's own voice felt small and thin in the vast room. "Quote 49, she said, repeating the professor's words. The man's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, passed through his eyes. He simply nodded, pressed a discreet button on his desk, and said, "Quote 50. A section of the wood-paneled wall behind him slid open with a whisper, quiet hiss, revealing a corridor of polished steel. Another man, equally well-dressed and impassive, emerged and gestured for her to follow. She was led down the corridor and into a small, private waiting room. It was furnished with austere but clearly priceless antiques. The silence in this room was even more profound. She sat on the edge of a stiff leather chair, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had expected security checks, questions, a lengthy process of verification. Instead, she was met with this quiet, unnerving acceptance. They were expecting her. The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. The door opened again, but it was not the bank employee who entered. It was a man she had never seen before, yet he moved with an air of complete ownership, as if the entire bank were his private study. He was tall, elegantly dressed in a suit that was a masterpiece of understated tailoring, and he had a face that was handsome in a severe, patrician way. He smiled, a warm, disarming expression that didn't reach his cold, intelligent eyes. "Miss Ilara Vance," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "A pleasure to finally meet you. Please don't be alarmed. My name is Julian Thorne, and I am here to simplify things for you." He sat in the chair opposite her, crossing his legs with a casual grace. He radiated an aura of effortless power and absolute confidence. This was the covenant. She knew it with every fiber of her being. "I know this must all be very confusing for you," he continued, his tone sympathetic, almost paternal. "A rusty music box, a scavenger hunt across Europe. Elena always did have a flair for the dramatic. A bit of a romantic, I'm afraid. She believed in grand gestures." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "But we are not romantics, are we? We are pragmatists. You and I. We live in the real world." He knew everything. He spoke of her grandmother with a familiar, dismissive affection that made Ilara's blood run cold. "Your grandmother was the steward of a great and powerful tool," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But she used it like a watering can, sprinkling a little here, a little there, a scholarship, a small clinic. Noble gestures, of course, but ultimately insignificant, like trying to put out a forest fire with a teacup. We, on the other hand, we understand how to use that tool. We don't want to water the garden, we want to command the river." This was the moment of temptation, the one the professor had warned her about. It wasn't a threat of violence, but something far more insidious, a carefully reasoned argument. He went on, his eyes sweeping over her simple coat, her worn shoes. Quote 59. He named a figure. Quote 60. The offer hung in the silent room, glittering and heavy. $20 million. dollars. The number was abstract, impossible. It was a solution to every problem she had ever had. It was a shield against the world. She thought of her cold apartment, of the constant gnawing anxiety about her bills, of her family's condescending pity. Thorne was offering her not just wealth, but victory. He was offering her the very thing they had denied her, magnified 1,000 times over. He saw the flicker of conflict in her eyes and pressed his advantage. He said softly. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. Julian Thorne sat back, confident, a patient predator who knew he had cornered his prey. The choice was hers, a life of unimaginable ease, or a life of unimaginable responsibility. The cold, quiet room felt like the center of the world, a fulcrum upon which Alara's entire existence was balanced. Julian Thorne's offer was not just a temptation, it was a mirror. In it, she saw reflected all of her own fears, her insecurities, her deep-seated desire for a life free from the constant, grinding pressure of poverty. He had expertly identified every vulnerability she possessed and crafted a key to unlock them. $20 million. dollars. The number echoed in the silent space, a siren song of escape. She could picture it, a warm, light-filled home, the ability to travel, to study, to never again have to choose between paying for groceries or repairing her leaking roof. She could even, in a moment of bitter fantasy, imagine the looks on her family's faces. Robert's grudging respect, Carol's fawning attention. She could buy their love, or at least a convincing imitation of it. It was everything they believed in, the ultimate validation in their materialistic world. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the seductive pull of that future. The weight of the keys in her coat lining suddenly felt immense, a crushing physical burden. The path Thorne was offering was so much lighter, so much easier. But then, through the fog of temptation, her grandmother's face swam into her mind. Not the frail, elderly woman of her last days, but the vibrant, strong Elena of her childhood. She remembered her grandmother's hands dusted with flour, showing her how to knead bread. She remembered her voice, reading stories from old leather-bound books. And she remembered her words, not just the ones in the journal, but the simple philosophies she had lived by every day. It is easy to be strong when you have everything, Alara, she had once said, looking out the window of their small kitchen. True strength is being kind when you have nothing. Thorne saw kindness as a weakness, charity as a waste. He saw people as pawns, communities as variables in a global equation. He wanted to command the river, but her grandmother had taught her that even the smallest drop of water could bring life to a parched field. Her gaze drifted from Thorne's perfectly polished shoes to her own worn, scuffed boots. She thought of the journey here, the fear and the exhaustion, the trust the professor had placed in her. She thought of the cold, dusty chapel and the moment she had found the second key, a moment of discovery that had felt more valuable than any amount of money. She was her grandmother's successor. To accept Thorne's offer would be to betray not just Elena's memory, but the very essence of who she was. It would be an admission that her family was right all along, that value is something that can only be measured in dollars and cents. It would be to sell her soul for a comfortable cage. She looked directly at Julian Thorne, and for the first time since he had entered the room, she did not feel intimidated. She saw him for what he was, a man trapped by his own cynical logic, a man who had so much power he had forgotten what it was for. He had a throne, but he had no kingdom worth ruling. A quiet calm settled over her. The frantic pounding of her heart slowed to a steady, resolute beat. She finally understood the last and most important test her grandmother had set for her. It wasn't about finding the keys or deciphering the journal. It was about this moment, right here. It was about being offered the world and having the strength to say no. She wasn't a fool, Alara said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence. The words were simple, but they held the weight of her conviction. Thorne's polite smile faltered for the briefest of moments. I beg your pardon? My grandmother, Alara repeated, meeting his cold gaze without flinching. She wasn't a fool. She was a gardener. She knew that real, lasting change doesn't come from redirecting rivers. It comes from tending to one seed at a time. She stood up, a small, unassuming figure in a simple coat. Yet in that moment, she felt taller than him. I am not interested in your offer. I am here to claim my inheritance. Julian Thorne's face hardened. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the cold, reptilian fury beneath. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of utter contempt. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle, a malfunction in his perfectly calculated machine. You are making a grave mistake, he said, his voice a low, menacing hiss. You have no idea the forces you are aligning yourself against. This burden you're so eager to claim, it will be your undoing. We will be watching. And when you falter, and you will falter, we will be there to take what is rightfully ours. It's not yours to take, Alara said simply. She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal more powerful than any argument, and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel his rage radiating across the room, a cold, impotent fury. She had faced her first test as the Guardian, and she had not broken. The choice had been made. The bank employee who had first greeted her reappeared, as if summoned by an unspoken signal. He led her from the waiting room without a word, his face as impassive as ever, as though the tense confrontation with Julian Thorne had never happened. They walked down another sterile corridor of steel and light, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The air grew colder, drier. They stopped before a massive circular vault door, a masterpiece of polished chrome and intricate locking mechanisms that looked more like a feature from a science fiction film than a bank. The employee used a key and a keypad, and the great door swung open with a silent, effortless grace, revealing the archival vault. The room was small, square, and bathed in a soft, even light. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with identical, anonymous safe deposit boxes made of gleaming stainless steel. There was no dust, no clutter, only the cold, clean geometry of absolute security. The employee gestured towards a specific box in the center of the far wall. It was no larger or smaller than any of the others. The contents require 2 keys to be used simultaneously, he stated, his voice flat and devoid of curiosity. He then produced a small, velvet-lined tray. Please. Ilara reached into her coat, her fingers closing around the 2 keys. She drew them out and placed them on the tray. The raven key, dark and heavy. The compass rose key, intricate and bright. They looked ancient and powerful against the modern, sterile backdrop of the vault. The employee inserted both keys into 2 separate locks on the deposit box. He turned them in unison. There was a soft, satisfying series of clicks, and he pulled the box from the wall. It slid out smoothly, a simple, unadorned steel container. He placed it on a small table in the center of the room. You may have as much time as you need, he said, and with a slight bow he retreated from the vault, the massive door hissing shut behind him, leaving Alara completely alone in the silent, illuminated space. For a long moment, she simply stood there, looking at the box. This was it, the end of the trail, the culmination of her grandmother's intricate design. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and lifted the lid. There was no sudden flood of light, no celestial choir. The contents were mundane, almost anticlimactic. There was no gold, no jewels, no stacks of cash. There were only papers, a thick stack of bearer bonds, their paper crisp and heavy, a portfolio of property deeds for land and buildings in a dozen different countries, a series of passbooks for numbered accounts in banks she had never heard of, and beneath it all, a single sealed envelope, identical to the one the professor had given her, with her name, Ilara, written on the front in her grandmother's familiar, elegant script. She sank into the single chair provided in the room and opened the letter. The paper was thick and smelled faintly of her grandmother's lavender perfume, a scent that brought a sudden, sharp pang of grief. The letter was not a list of instructions or a final riddle. It was a welcome. My dearest Ilara, it began. If you are reading this, then you have found your way. I know the path was not easy, and I am sorry for the fear and the uncertainty I have put you through, but I needed to be sure. Not of your intelligence, my dear. I never doubted that. But of your heart. I needed to know that you would understand that this is not a gift, but a duty. The world is full of men like Julian Thorne, men who see wealth as a weapon and people as pawns. They are loud and they are powerful. But our way, the Guardian's way, is quiet. We are the roots of the tree unseen beneath the ground, providing nourishment. We are the steady hand that shelters a candle's flame in the wind. We do not seek recognition or power. We seek only to leave the world a little brighter, a little warmer than we found it. As she read, tears streamed down Alara's face, dripping onto the precious paper. They were tears of sorrow, of relief, of a profound, overwhelming love. This legacy is now yours, my dear girl. It will be heavy. There will be days you wish you could set it down. The covenant will not cease their efforts. They will watch you. They will test you. They will try to break you. But you are stronger than you know. You have my blood in your veins, but more importantly, you have my hope in your heart. Use this tool wisely. Build, heal, teach, protect. Be the quiet good in a noisy world. The letter ended with a simple, powerful declaration. The money is not your inheritance. The responsibility is. I am so very proud of you, my guardian. All my love, Elena. Alara sat for a long time in the absolute silence of the vault. The paper spread before her, the letter clutched in her hand. The numbers on the bonds and account statements were dizzying, almost meaningless in their scale. But they were no longer what mattered. She looked at her reflection in the polished steel of the open deposit box. The face that looked back was not the timid, overlooked girl from the solicitor's office. It was a woman's face. Her eyes were clear, her expression calm and resolute. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steely purpose. The true inheritance wasn't the fortune. It was the strength she had discovered within herself. The strength to understand its purpose, to bear its weight, and to refuse it for her own gain. Her journey hadn't ended here in this cold, sterile vault. It had just begun. She carefully gathered the documents, placed them back in the box, and slid it shut. She was no longer just Alara Vance, the librarian. She was the guardian, and she had work to do.